Ellie Mae Voss was 27 years old, 6 months pregnant, and standing before the one door her husband's family had never allowed her to open. It sat at the far end of the old shearing shed, where Texas dust pushed through the wall cracks and loose wool gathered in corners like pale, forgotten snow. The door was narrow, gray, and crossed with a rusted iron hasp. Someone had nailed a warped board across it years ago, as if a room full of old wool could still be dangerous. Every time Ellie asked about it, Waylon Voss gave the same cold answer. That room has nothing for you. Now she had almost nothing herself. A canvas bag, a dented tin of savings, her mother's blanket folded under one arm, and the child inside her, quiet beneath her palm. 3 days earlier, the Voss family had thrown her out of the ranch house. The next morning, at the county auction, people laughed when she spent her last $18 on the ruined shearing shed nobody wanted. They said it was only good for snakes, rot, and scrap tin. But what nobody knew was that behind that forbidden door, buried under years of dust and silence, was something the Voss family had spent a lifetime trying to keep from her. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If stories like this mean something to you, hit the like button and subscribe, because this one begins with a woman everyone had already counted out. Long before Ellie wore the Voss name, she had belonged to Lydia May Bell. That was her mother's name, written in careful blue ink on flour sacks, church envelopes, and the backs of grocery receipts. Lydia died when Ellie was young, and after the funeral, the adults spoke of her as if she had been weak, unlucky, and never made for ranch life. But Ellie remembered different things. She remembered Lydia beside the kitchen window before sunrise, fingers moving through wool thread with patient care. Inside, the little house smelled of cedar smoke, lanolin, and plants boiling in iron pots. "Color is something you earn," Lydia once said, lifting wet wool from a dye bath. "You wait for it." Mesquite bark gave warm brown. Pecan hulls made soft earth. Yucca left pale yellow. Wild indigo turned deep as evening. Ellie was too small to understand the work, but she understood the wonder. Her mother could take plain wool and make it hold the colors of dust, rain clouds, riverbeds, and twilight. After Lydia was gone, those things disappeared. The dye pots vanished first, then the bundles of wool, then the papers Ellie remembered tied with red string. By the time she was 10, the only thing left was a hand-woven blanket folded at the foot of her bed. It was striped with indigo blue and clay red, with 3 small triangle patterns stitched near the border. Whenever Ellie asked where it came from, the adults looked away, so she stopped asking, but she never stopped keeping things. Ellie learned to save what other people threw aside. A dull needle, a loose button, a torn feed sack, a scrap of wool caught on a fence nail. By 14, she could mend a shirt so cleanly the tear almost disappeared. By 16, she could tell good wool from brittle wool by rubbing it between her fingers. By 18, she had started a little notebook, writing down colors from plants near the ranch roads. Pecan hulls, longer boil, darker brown. Mesquite bark, best after rain. Wild indigo, stains hands for days. The notebook was bent from apron pockets, but Ellie guarded it like a map back to her mother. When she married Cole Voss, people said she was lucky. The Voss ranch had land, fencing, and a name people recognized in 3 counties. Cole was handsome in the easy way of men who had never had to earn attention. His father, Waylon, walked the property each morning with a face carved by sun and pride. At first, Ellie tried to be useful. She cooked. She swept red dust from the porch. She mended work shirts, patched saddle blankets, and cleaned the shed after shearing season. But there was always one place she could not touch: the wool room. It stood at the back of the shearing shed, past the cutting table and rusted racks where fleeces once hung to dry. The rest of the shed was neglected but open. That one room stayed locked. One afternoon, Ellie paused before it with a broom in her hand. Near the lower corner of the door, almost hidden under grime, she saw a carved mark. 3 triangles and a curved line. Her fingers tightened around the broom. It was the same pattern sewn into her mother's blanket. Before she could kneel closer, Cole appeared behind her. "Leave that alone." "What's in there?" Ellie asked. "Old junk." "Then why is it locked?" Cole's face closed. "Because Dad wants it locked." That evening, Waylon stood in the kitchen doorway while Ellie washed dishes. "That back room has nothing for you," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. After that, Ellie learned the shape of her own loneliness. It lived in the pause after she spoke, and no one answered. It lived in the way Cole and Waylon stopped talking when she entered a room. It lived in the trucks that began arriving before dawn to haul away sheep she had helped tend. By the time her pregnancy began to show, the ranch had grown strangely quiet. No lambs cried from the pens. No shearers came through the gate. Cole came home late with dust on his boots. Waylon spent long hours inside the shearing shed, with the doors shut. One night, Ellie woke to tires on gravel. She stepped onto the porch, wrapped in her mother's blanket, and saw lantern light glowing at the far end of the shed. Two shadows moved near the forbidden room. Paper scraped, wood dragged, a lock clicked shut. The next morning, a new chain hung across the wool room door. Cole was waiting at the kitchen table. In front of him lay a folded paper, a fountain pen, and her name written where he expected her to sign. Outside, the Texas wind pressed dust against the windows, and for the first time, Ellie understood that the life closing around her had been planned long before she saw the door. The paper on the kitchen table was not long. That was the first thing Ellie noticed. For something meant to empty a life, it took up less space than a church bulletin. One page. Two signatures waited at the bottom. Cole's name had been written in a quick hand. Waylon's initials sat beside a notary stamp from town. Only Ellie's line remained blank. She stood with her mother's blanket around her shoulders and felt the baby shift inside her. Morning light came through the dusty window above the sink. A pan sat unwashed on the stove. Coffee had gone cold in Cole's cup. Everything looked ordinary, and that made it worse. "What is this?" Ellie asked. Cole turned the fountain pen between his fingers. "It is just paperwork," he said. Waylon stood behind him near the pantry door, hat still on, thumbs hooked in his belt. He watched Ellie the way a rancher watched weather he had already decided to blame. Ellie stepped closer and read the first lines. She did not understand every legal phrase, but she understood enough. The paper said she acknowledged no claim to Voss land, livestock, equipment, trademarks, accounts, or future income attached to the ranch. It also said her child would make no claim through her against existing Voss property. Her eyes moved to the last paragraph. "This includes the baby," she said. Cole finally looked at her. There was no apology in his face, only irritation, as if she had made him say something unpleasant out loud. "It protects everyone," he said. "No," Ellie whispered. "It protects you." Waylon gave a short laugh. "Girl, you came into this family with a suitcase and a dead woman's blanket. Do not start talking like you built something here." The words struck cleanly because they found the old wound first. Ellie looked toward the window. Beyond the glass, the pens were empty. The shearing shed stood in the distance, with its gray boards and rusted roof. The new chain on the wool room door caught the sun like a thin line of fire. For weeks, she had watched the ranch empty itself. At first, it had been small things. A stack of wool sacks missing from the storage wall, a coil of good rope gone from the lambing room, two old shearers leaving before noon, their eyes lowered as they passed her on the porch. Then the trucks came. They arrived before daylight, when the sky was still violet and the hills looked like sleeping animals. Men, Ellie, did not know loaded sheep through the dust, while Cole stood with a clipboard and Waylon smoked by the fence. Ellie had come out barefoot the first morning, one hand pressed to her back, asking where the flock was going. "Sale barn," Cole said. "All of them?" "Enough." But by the fourth morning, even the old ewes were gone. The pens held only trampled straw, broken twine, and the smell of animals that no longer belonged to the place. A ranch without sheep made a strange silence. No bleating at dawn. No hooves tapping against gate rails. No dogs circling the fence line. No fresh wool snagged on wire. It was as if someone had taken the breath out of the land and left the building standing. Ellie tried asking questions at supper. Cole answered with half words. Waylon answered with none. She began to understand that, Silence was not emptiness. Sometimes silence was a locked drawer. Sometimes it was a door with a chain across it. Sometimes it was two men waiting for a woman to stop noticing, so she noticed more. She noticed the feed bills had been pulled from the nail beside the stove. She noticed a bank envelope tucked beneath Waylon's plate. She noticed Cole burning papers in a barrel behind the barn, feeding them into the flames, one careful handful at a time. When the wind shifted, a blackened scrap landed near Ellie's shoe. She waited until Cole went inside before she picked it up. Most of the writing was gone, but one line remained. Custom dyed blankets. Spring order. Deposit received. At the bottom, nearly burned away, were three letters she could still read. L. M. B. Lydia May Bell. Ellie folded the scrap into her notebook with shaking hands. After that, the name began appearing in places people thought she would not look. On the back of an old shipping tag, under dust on a wooden crate, in a receipt book wedged behind the flour tin. Always small, always half-hidden, always close to wool. When Ellie asked Cole whether her mother had ever worked for the Voss Ranch, he went still. "Who told you that?" "No one. I found her initials." Cole pushed his chair back. "You are digging in things that do not belong to you. My mother belongs to me." Waylon's voice came from the hallway. "Your mother left what she could not handle." Ellie turned toward him slowly. "That is not an answer. It is the only one you need." The next morning, the chain appeared on the wool room door. Now the paper lay before her, asking her to sign away land she had worked, animals she had tended, a future she carried, and a history no one would explain. Cole slid the pen across the table. "Sign it, Ellie." The baby moved again, soft but certain. Ellie looked at the blank line waiting for her name. For most of her life, other people had told her when to stop asking, when to be grateful, when to accept the smaller portion. But the burned scrap in her notebook seemed to warm against her ribs like a coal. She pushed the pen back. "No." Cole's jaw tightened. Waylon took one step forward, and the kitchen, which had once smelled of coffee and bread and ordinary mornings, suddenly felt like the smallest room on earth. Cole did not shout at first. That was what Ellie remembered later, the strange quiet before the chair scraped back. Cole stared at the unsigned paper, as if her refusal had made it heavier. Waylon stood behind him with one hand on the pantry frame, his face flat and hard. "You do not get to say no," Cole said. Ellie kept both hands on the table. If she let go, they would see them tremble. "I just did." Waylon gave a low whistle. "She thinks carrying a Voss child makes her a Voss." "This baby is not a bargaining chip," Ellie said. "No," Waylon answered. "It is a complication." The word landed colder than any curse. Cole rose so fast his coffee tipped over. Brown liquid spread across the table and soaked into the paper. He snatched it up and cursed. "Look what you made me do." Ellie almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the sentence had become part of the walls. The unpaid bill, the late supper, the memory of her mother that sharpened Waylon's eyes whenever Ellie said Lydia's name. Somehow, all of it had found a way to become her fault. "I am not signing it," she said. Cole stepped close enough for her to smell whiskey under his morning coffee. "Then you can leave." For one moment, Ellie thought she had misheard him. Outside, wind moved dust across the yard. The kitchen clock ticked above the stove. "I live here," she said. Waylon laughed once. "You sleep here. There is a difference." Cole walked into the bedroom. Ellie followed when she heard drawers opening. He pulled her clothes out by the handful and dropped them into the canvas bag she used for laundry. Dresses, stockings, a worn sweater, her work apron. He did not fold anything. He did not look at what he touched. "Cole, stop." He opened the little cedar box on the dresser. Ellie moved quickly. "Do not touch that." Inside were the only things she had guarded from childhood. The notebook, a few coins, Lydia's wooden comb, the burned scrap marked LMB, and a tiny pair of baby socks she had begun knitting from leftover yarn. Cole reached for the notebook. Ellie put her hand over it first. Their eyes met. For a second, the man she had married flickered somewhere behind his face. Or maybe she only wanted him to. Then he looked toward the doorway. where Wayland stood like a judge. "Let her keep her little book," Wayland said. "It will not feed her." Quote. Cole carried the canvas bag to the front door and threw it onto the porch. The bag landed open, her apron slid out across the boards. Then came the blanket. It had been folded over the rocking chair, indigo and clay red dulled by years, but still whole. Cole grabbed it with one hand. Ellie caught the other end. "No, it is in my house. It was my mother's." Cole pulled. The old wool stretched between them. For the first time that morning, Ellie raised her voice. "Let go." Cole released it after one hard tug that sent Ellie backward against the wall. Her shoulders struck the doorframe. Pain flashed bright and brief. She wrapped the blanket around herself and stood breathing through it, one hand moving to her belly. Wayland's gaze dropped to that hand. "You are making this harder than it has to be," he said. "No," Ellie said. "You are." Cole took the ranch keys from the hook beside the door. He slid off the truck key she used for errands, doctor visits, feed runs, and grocery trips. "You will not need this." "How am I supposed to get anywhere?" "That is no longer my concern." The sentence did what the paper could not. It ended the last small belief that Cole might still be ashamed of himself. Ellie bent down, picked up her apron, and pushed it into the canvas bag. She placed the cedar box inside carefully. The notebook went beneath the baby socks. The burned scrap stayed hidden between the pages. Wayland stepped onto the porch behind her. "You go into town and tell whatever story you want," he said. "They will know what you are. A girl who came with nothing and wanted more." Ellie lifted the bag strap over her shoulder. It pulled hard against her back, but she did not adjust it. "I wanted what was true." Wayland smiled without warmth. "Truth does not put a roof over your head." She looked past him toward the shearing shed. The forbidden room sat hidden beyond its outer wall, locked and silent. The new chain was invisible from here, but Ellie could feel it as clearly as if it had been wrapped around her own ribs. Cole stood inside the doorway. He did not come onto the porch. Ellie waited one breath longer than she needed to, giving him the chance to call her back, to say her name like it still meant something. He only shut the door. The sound was not loud. It was ordinary wood meeting ordinary frame, but it moved through Ellie like a verdict. She walked down the porch steps. The yard stretched wide and bare before her. The ranch dogs watched from the shade and did not follow. Red dust lifted around her shoes. She had no truck, no husband, no room, no promise of help from anyone whose name mattered in that county. At the gate, she stopped. Her breath came unevenly, and the baby shifted as if waking. Ellie placed one hand on her stomach and the other on the post. Behind her stood the Voss house. Beyond it stood the shearing shed. For years, she had been told there was nothing in that back room for her. Now she wondered why they had worked so hard to keep her from nothing. By sundown, Ellie had walked 3 miles to the road crossing, where Mrs. Harlan, the postmistress, found her sitting on her canvas bag beneath a live oak. Mrs. Harlan looked at Ellie's face, then at her swollen belly, and said, "Get in, child." That night, Ellie slept on a narrow cot in the back room of the post office, wrapped in her mother's blanket, listening to mail sacks creak on their hooks. In the morning, with $18.40 left in her dented tin, she walked to the county clerk's office and asked the oldest question of the dispossessed. "What is the cheapest place in this county that nobody wants?" The county clerk's office smelled of paper, floor wax, and old rain. Ellie had been there only twice before, both times beside Cole, both times quiet, while men behind desks spoke over her shoulder. That morning, she stood alone with her canvas bag against her ankle, her mother's blanket folded over one arm, and dust still clinging to the hem of her dress. Mr. Pritchard looked over his spectacles. "You are asking for tax forfeit property?" "I am asking for the cheapest place nobody wants." He waited, as if someone else might step in and explain her. No one did. Ellie opened her dented tin on the counter. $18.40 rolled out in small, tired sounds. Mr. Pritchard pulled a ledger from beneath the desk and ran one finger down the page. Most places were still too much. A rocky pasture, a collapsed smokehouse, a creek lot with back taxes. Then his finger stopped. "There is one," he said. but I would not advise it. Ellie looked up. Old Shearing shed parcel, South Boundary Road, split off from the Voss Ranch years back. No listed water rights, no electricity, roof damage, salvage value only. The Voss name settled between them like dust. How much? It goes to county auction this morning. Opening bid is $18. Ellie looked at the coins. $18. The exact amount she could spend and still keep 40 cents for bread. Mr. Pritchard lowered his voice. Mrs. Voss, that building is not fit for living. It is hardly fit for standing. Does it come with a deed? If purchased and recorded, yes. In my name? He studied her for a long moment. Yes. In your name. The auction was held in a back room of the courthouse, where ceiling fans turned slowly through stale heat. Only a few people had come. 2 farmers, a land agent, a widow looking at a garden lot, and Waylon Voss. He stood near the front with his hat in his hands. When Ellie entered, the room seemed to tighten around her. Waylon's eyes moved from her face to her belly, then to the bag she carried. Well, he said, loud enough for the room. Charity has a busy morning. Ellie sat in the last row. The auctioneer read the parcels in a flat voice. The garden lot sold. The smokehouse drew no bid. The rocky pasture went to the land agent. Then he adjusted his glasses. Parcel 14B. Former shearing shed structure and immediate ground, South Boundary Road. Opening bid, $18. One farmer snorted. Only thing in that shed is rattlers and old sheep stink. Someone laughed. Any bid at 18? The auctioneer asked. Ellie lifted her hand. The laughter did not stop right away. It thinned slowly, turning into whispers. The land agent turned to look at her. The widow near the aisle pressed her lips together. Waylon turned last. For one clean second, surprise showed on his face. You do not want that, he said. Ellie kept her hand raised. I have 18, the auctioneer said. Any 19. Waylon could have bid. Ellie saw the thought cross his eyes. But if he bid against her, he would admit the ruined shed mattered. He would tell the whole room that a place he had called worthless was worth protecting. So he stayed silent. 18 once. The ceiling fan clicked. 18 twice. Ellie's hand ached, but she did not lower it. Sold. To Mrs. Ellie Mae Voss. Waylon's head snapped toward the auctioneer. Ellie stood before anyone could speak. At the table, Mr. Pritchard pointed to the line. Her knees felt weak as she signed. The ink caught at the start of her name, leaving a dark mark. Ellie Mae Voss. For once, the paper did not belong to Cole. It did not carry Waylon's initials above hers. It held her name alone. Mr. Pritchard sanded the ink, folded the deed, and handed it over. Waylon met her outside on the courthouse steps. You have no idea what you just bought. Ellie tucked the deed inside her notebook. I bought what nobody wanted. That shed sits beside my land. No, Ellie said. It sits beside land you still call yours. His face hardened. For a moment, she thought he might step closer, but 2 women passed with parcels from the mercantile, and he put on his hat instead. You will come crawling back before Sunday. Ellie looked toward the south road. No, I do not think I will. By late afternoon, Mrs. Harlan drove her as far as the cattle guard near the old boundary road. Ellie climbed down carefully with her canvas bag, her blanket, and the deed pressed flat inside her notebook. The postmistress looked at the long red road ahead. You sure about this, child? Ellie was not sure about anything. The road was narrow and washed into ruts. Cedar trees leaned away from the wind. Dry grass hissed along the fence line. Far off, the Texas hills rose blue beneath the sinking sun. But somewhere beyond that road stood a ruined shed with a locked room inside it. And for the first time in her life, the paper that mattered was in her own hands. She thanked Mrs. Harlan, adjusted the bag on her shoulder, and started walking. Behind her, the truck turned back toward town. Ahead, dust lifted over the road like a curtain. By the time the shearing shed appeared against the evening light, it looked less like a building than a thing the land had tried to forget. Its roof sagged, its walls leaned. One loose sheet of tin flashed in the sun like a warning. Ellie stopped at the gate, breathless and aching. The place was worse than she remembered. Then, she touched the deed inside her notebook. It was ruined. It was lonely. It was barely standing, but it was hers. The gate did not open cleanly. Ellie had to set down her canvas bag, lift the sagging wire with both hands, and push her shoulder against the old cedar post until it groaned loose from the dirt. Rust flaked onto her fingers. The fence line shivered in the wind, as if it wanted to fall and be done with standing. She slipped through, pulled the bag after her, and faced the shearing shed. From the road, it had looked broken. Up close, it looked abandoned by every promise ever made under its roof. One side leaned toward a stand of prickly pear. The tin roof had peeled back in 2 places, leaving black gaps where the evening sky showed through. A door hung from one hinge. The long sorting table outside had split down the middle. Near the loading ramp, old sheep droppings had hardened into the dirt, gray with age. Ellie stood still and listened. No sheep, no men, no dogs, no sound from the ranch house beyond the hill. Only wind dragging through loose metal. She stepped inside. The smell struck first. Old wool, dust, mouse nests, dry rot, and rust. Sunlight entered through roof holes in slanted bars and caught in floating dust. Along one wall, ripped wool sacks sagged open, their contents gray and stiff. In the corner, something small skittered under a pile of boards. Ellie pressed one hand to her stomach. "All right," she whispered. "We will be careful." Her voice sounded too small in the shed. She walked slowly, testing each floorboard before putting weight on it. Some bent. One cracked under her heel and made her grab the cutting table from a balance. Pain pulled low across her back, and she stood breathing until it passed. Near the far wall stood the wool room door. The chain was still there, newer than everything around it, dark and clean against old wood. Ellie did not go to it. Not yet. She had learned enough from hunger and fear to know that mystery could wait until after shelter. The first work was staying alive until morning. She chose the driest corner, near a half wall that still blocked the wind. With both hands, she dragged aside broken boards, empty feed sacks, and brittle twine. A dead scorpion lay curled under a tin lid. Ellie carried it outside on the end of a stick, then came back and swept the dirt with a flat piece of scrap wood. The corner did not become clean. It became less dangerous. That was enough. She found an old workbench with 3 good legs and a 4th propped on a stone. On top of it sat a cracked lantern, a coffee tin full of bent nails, and a pair of heavy shears eaten dull by rust. Beneath it was a wooden crate filled with things no one had bothered to steal. Baling wire, a hammer with a split handle, 2 feed sacks without holes, and a coil of rope stiff as bone. Ellie touched each item with care. Not treasure. Tools. There was a difference, and she trusted tools more. The stove sat near the middle of the shed, small and black, its pipe leaning crookedly toward a hole in the roof. At first, Ellie thought it was useless. The door was stuck, the belly rusted, and a bird had nested in the pipe. But when she cleared the straw and scraped the hinges with a nail, the little iron door gave one stubborn pop and opened. Inside was dry ash. No water had reached it. Ellie smiled for the first time that day. It was not joy. It was the smallest kind of mercy. She gathered dry splinters from broken crates and mesquite twigs from outside. Her hands were scratched by the time she stacked them in the stove. The matches in her apron pocket had survived the walk wrapped in wax paper. The first one broke. The second flared and died. The third caught a strip of feed sack, and the feed sack caught the mesquite. Smoke coughed into the room before finding the pipe. Ellie stepped back, eyes watering. "Come on," she whispered. The flame held. As dusk thickened, the little stove threw a weak orange light across the boards. It showed the ruin plainly. The leaning wall, the holes, the chain on the wool room door, the weathered racks where fleeces once hung. But it also gave the shed a center, a place where warmth could begin. Ellie spread one feed sack on the floor, folded the other beneath her hip, and wrapped herself in Lydia's blanket. She ate half the bread, Mrs. Harlan had pressed into her hand, saving the rest for morning. Every bite tasted of flour, salt, and the fact that someone had not looked away. Before lying down, she opened her notebook and slid the deed between 2 pages. The paper had already softened at the edges from being held too tightly. Ellie looked at her written name. In the ranch house, her name had been something others used when they wanted obedience. On this deed, it looked different. Thin, shaky, but standing. Night settled hard over the hill country. The shed changed after dark. Every small sound grew teeth. Tin clicked overhead. Mice moved inside the wall. Wind pushed under the broken door and lifted loose strands of wool across the floor. Once, from somewhere outside, came the dry buzz of a rattlesnake, distant but real. Ellie lay still, listening. Fear moved through her in waves. She let it come. She had no strength to pretend she was not afraid. She only refused to let fear decide what her hands would do next. When the stove burned low, she fed it 2 more sticks. When the wind shifted, she moved the canvas bag against the gap beneath the wall. When pain tightened across her stomach, she breathed the way Lydia had once taught her after a childhood fall. Slow in, slower out. Count the boards, count the knots, count what is still yours. Blanket, notebook, baby, deed, fire. By dawn, Ellie had slept less than an hour, but she had survived the first night. Morning came pale and dusty. She stepped outside, stiff and sore, hair loose around her face, and looked behind the shed for anything useful. That was when she found the pump. It stood half hidden by weeds, its handle frozen upright, its spout packed with mud dauber nests. No trough sat beneath it anymore. It looked as dead as the rest of the place. Still, Ellie cleared the weeds. She broke the nests loose with a stick. She wrapped both hands around the handle and pulled. Nothing moved. She pulled again. Pain shot up her arms. On the third try, the handle dropped an inch with a shriek of metal. Ellie worked it slowly, oiling the hinge with a little grease from Mrs. Harlan's bread paper. The pump complained. It fought her. It gave back only rust, dust, and air. Then, after many slow pulls, something coughed deep underground. A brown spit of water struck the dirt. Ellie froze. The next pull brought more. Muddy, thin. Not clean enough to drink yet, but water all the same. She put her palm beneath the spout and let it fill. The water trembled in her hand, cloudy and precious. Ellie looked back at the ruined shed, the broken roof, the leaning wall, the locked room. It was not safe. It was not ready. It was not kind, but it had fire. It had tools. It had water. And for that morning, that was enough. The first clear day after Ellie found the pump, she began to sort the shed by what could hurt her and what could help her. Sharp boards went outside. Good boards leaned against the wall. Rusted nails went into the coffee tin. Rope, wire, sacks, and anything with a use went beneath the workbench. She moved slowly, stopping whenever her back tightened or the baby pressed hard beneath her ribs. The work was not brave in any grand way. It was bending, lifting, coughing dust, and deciding not to quit. By noon, a path had opened from the broken front door to the stove. By late afternoon, she had cleared enough space to see the long shape of the old shearing floor. Faint lines remained in the boards, where men had once dragged wool sacks toward the sorting table. Near the far end, the dust lay thicker, untouched by wind. That was where the wool room waited. The chain across the door looked wrong in daylight. Everything else in the shed belonged to age. Gray wood, rusted hinges, sun-faded rope, cracked leather straps. The chain was newer, dark, and deliberate. It had not been left behind. It had been added. Ellie stood before it with the broom in her hand. She told herself not to open it yet. She needed food. She needed a proper roof patch. She needed to find a way to make the pump water clear. A locked room could wait, but the mark near the bottom of the door would not let her look away. 3 triangles, 1 curved line, the same pattern stitched into Lydia's blanket. Ellie knelt carefully, one hand on the wall for balance. The mark was almost buried under grime. She wiped it with the corner of her sleeve. Under the dirt, the carving had been made by a steady hand, not a child's scratch, not a ranch hand's idle knife cut. A maker's mark. Her throat tightened. She went to her canvas bag, unfolded her mother's blanket, and carried it back to the door. The afternoon light had turned gold and thin. She spread the blanket across the cutting table, and smoothed the border with both hands. There it was. 3 small triangles, 1 curved line, not similar, the same. For a long while, Ellie did not move. All her life, that blanket had been treated like a sad leftover, the last soft thing from a woman people wanted forgotten. But here, on a door Waylon had forbidden her to touch, the same sign had been carved into wood. A sign meant to say, "This belongs together." Ellie folded the blanket with care and tucked it under her arm. Then she examined the door again. The lock itself was too strong for the tools she had. But the doorframe was old. One hinge had pulled slightly away from the wood. Behind a warped board nailed across the lower panel, something thin had caught in a crack. Ellie set down the broom and used the split-handled hammer to work at the board. She did not swing hard. Noise carried in open country, and the Voss ranch was not far beyond the rise. Instead, she pried slowly, easing each nail until the wood gave a tired groan. Behind it, a narrow space opened between 2 wall planks. Something slid down and tapped the floor. Ellie froze. It was a photograph. The edges were curled. The surface was scratched. Dust had filmed the faces until they looked like ghosts. Ellie picked it up by the corners and carried it to the doorway where the light was stronger. At first, she saw only a woman standing beside a loom. Then, the woman's face came clear. Ellie sat down hard on the threshold. It was Lydia May Bell, not the faded, sickly woman people described after her death. Not the weak wife Waylon had dismissed. This woman stood straight, sleeves rolled to the elbow, one hand resting on a half-finished blanket. Her chin was lifted. Her eyes looked directly at the camera with the calm of someone who knew the value of her own work. Behind her, nailed to the wall, was a painted board. Most of the letters had blurred with age, but Ellie could still read them. Voss Woolworks, handmade in Texas. Her hands began to shake. Voss Woolworks. The name she had seen half burned on paper. The name stamped on old crates. The name Cole had turned away from her whenever she noticed it. And there, in the middle of it, stood her mother. Ellie turned the photograph over. On the back, in blue ink faded nearly gray, were 4 words. Lydia's first run. No date. No explanation. No signature. Only proof that Lydia had been there. Ellie pressed the photograph against her chest, but comfort did not come. Something colder rose beneath it. For years, Waylon had told her the room held nothing. Cole had called it junk. They had chained it, blocked it, hidden it, and laughed when she bought the shed. No one worked that hard to hide nothing. The wind moved through the open roof and lifted dust along the floor. A loose strip of wool rolled against Ellie's boot. She looked from the photograph to the locked door, then to the blanket beneath her arm. The mark, the initials, the burned receipt, the hidden picture, the new chain. They were pieces of a pattern she could not yet see whole. Ellie slid the photograph into her notebook beside the burned scrap marked L.M.B. Then she closed the cover and held it flat beneath both hands. Outside, evening gathered over the hill country. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the Voss ranch sat quiet, pretending the past had stayed buried. Ellie looked at the wool room door. She still did not know what waited inside, but for the first time, she understood that the room had never been empty. It had only been waiting for the one person they never wanted to let in. Ellie waited until the next morning to open the wool room, not because she was no longer curious, but because curiosity had to bend itself around survival. Before sunrise, she patched 2 roof holes with scrap tin. She pumped enough muddy water to boil. She ate the last heel of Mrs. Harlan's bread, then sat on the overturned crate, with her notebook open on her lap. The photograph lay beside the burned scrap. Lydia's first run. A. M. B. Voss Woolworks. 3 pieces of the same buried thing. Ellie did not have the strength to break the lock, and she did not trust the noise it would make. So, she studied the door the way her mother had once studied, color slowly, patiently, waiting for the weak place to show itself. The hasp was new. The chain was new. The hinges were not. They were old iron, fastened into dry wood with screws that had rusted into brown flowers. Ellie took the split-handled hammer, the dull shears, and a bent nail from the coffee tin. She knelt beside the lower hinge and worked the nail under the first screw head. It took nearly an hour. Her knees ached. Sweat ran down her neck. Twice she had to stop and breathe through a hard pull in her back. But the screw turned a little, then a little more, until it dropped into her palm like a tooth. By noon, the lower hinge hung loose. By late afternoon, the upper hinge gave way. Ellie set both hands against the door and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the old wood sighed inward, and air came out of the room. It smelled of wool, dust, dried plants, iron, and time. Ellie stood at the threshold without stepping in. The wool room was narrow, but deeper than she expected. Light came through one high cracked window, falling across a loom covered with a canvas sheet. Along the walls stood shelves of glass jars, wooden boxes, folded sacks, and old paper bundles tied with string. A spinning wheel leaned in one corner. Rusted shears hung on nails. A long table ran beneath the window, stained with rings from dye pots. Everything had been left, as if someone meant to return after supper. Ellie crossed the threshold. Dust rose around her shoes. She pulled the canvas from the loom first. The frame beneath was old pecan wood, polished by use where hands had touched it. A half-woven blanket still stretched across it, unfinished but intact, its pattern held in suspended silence. Indigo, clay red, soft yellow, 3 triangles near the border, 1 curved line. Ellie touched the threads with 2 fingers. They did not crumble. Behind the loom sat a row of small jars. Each had a paper label written in faded blue ink. Mesquite bark, pecan hull, yucca root, wild indigo, cochineal, iron rinsa. Ellie knew some of those names from her own notebook. Seeing them here, in Lydia's handwriting, felt like hearing her mother answer from another room. On the table lay a stack of cloth samples wrapped in brown paper. Each square had a pattern number, color notes, and a price. Beneath them were order slips, some addressed to women in San Antonio, Fredericksburg, Kerrville, even as far as Santa Fe. The first slips were signed Lydia May Bell. Later, slips had the same designs, the same color names, the same handwriting underneath the calculations. But the printed line at the top had changed. Voss Woolworks. Ellie felt the room tilt around her. She sat down on the stool beside the loom and forced herself to read slowly. She had learned, from years of being dismissed, that people counted on women like her to become emotional before they became precise. So she became precise. She sorted the papers into piles: recipes, customer names, payments, pattern drawings, letters, receipts. In the second drawer of the die table, she found a ledger bound in cracked brown leather. The pages were stiff but dry. On the first page, Lydia had written, Lydia May Bell, wool dye and blanket orders. First full season. The early entries were careful and proud. Names of buyers, wool weight, plant colors used, deposit paid, balance due, notes about which customers preferred tighter weave, which wanted wedding blankets, which bought baby blankets, which asked for the hill country sunset pattern. Then, halfway through the book, Lydia's name began to vanish. Not all at once. First, someone crossed out Bell and wrote Voss above it. Then, in later pages, Lydia's initials appeared only in the margin. The orders grew larger. The prices rose. The same patterns traveled farther. And at the bottom of one page, in Waylon Voss's blunt hand, someone had written, Brand belongs to ranch. Ellie read the line 3 times. The room seemed quieter after that. In a lower drawer, beneath a folded piece of muslin, she found the letter. It was addressed in the same blue ink. For my Ellie, if she ever comes looking. The paper shook in Ellie's hands before she unfolded it. Lydia's voice came through simply, not like a ghost, not like a miracle, but like a woman who had known paper might outlive the people who tried to silence her. My sweet girl, if this room is still standing, then something of mine survived. That is more than I was promised. They will tell you this work was nothing. They will say I only helped. They will say the ranch made the name, and I was lucky to stand near it. Do not believe them. These colors were made by my hands, from the land my mother taught me to read. These patterns were drawn while you slept beside the stove. Every blanket I sold carried a piece of the life I hoped to leave you. If they take the ranch, keep the wool room. Not because it is worth money, though it may be. Keep it because a woman must know when her name has been stolen. Do not sell your hands cheaply. Do not let them put another name over yours. Ellie pressed the letter to her mouth. For a while, she could not read further. Outside, wind tapped loose tin against the roof. Inside, the loom waited in the dusty light. The baby moved beneath her ribs, and Ellie held the letter there, against the place where one life met the next. When she could breathe again, she searched the room more carefully. Behind the dye table was a shallow wall cabinet hidden by a hanging feed sack. Inside were folded labels, dozens of them, never used. Lydia May Bell Woolens, hand-dyed in Texas. Ellie stared at the name. Not Voss. Bell. Her mother had not been only a helper. She had not been a weak woman who left nothing behind. She had built a business with color, wool, memory, and patience. Then someone had crossed out her name and used her work until the story belonged to the men who locked the door. The hidden value was not gold. Gold would have been simpler. This room held tools enough to begin again. The loom, the recipes, the samples, the customer ledger, the labels, the proof of stolen work. It held the method, it held the market, it held the truth. And it held a choice. Ellie could sell it to Waylon and be free of the fight for a while. Or she could learn the work well enough to put her own name where Lydia's had been removed. She gathered the ledger, the letter, the photograph, and the old labels. She wrapped them in her mother's blanket, then slid the bundle into the safest place she knew, beneath the loose floorboard under the workbench, where she had hidden the deed. After that, she returned to the loom. The half-finished blanket waited beneath her hand. She did not know enough yet to finish it. Not properly. Not with the respect it deserved. But she could tie off the broken threads. She could cover it from dust. She could keep the moths away. She could begin by refusing to let it decay another day. As evening settled, Ellie stood in the wool room doorway and looked back at what had been hidden from her. A ruined shed had given her fire. A stubborn pump had given her water. And now a locked room had given her a name. For the first time since Cole shut the ranch door, Ellie did not feel like a woman thrown out of someone else's life. She felt like a woman standing at the beginning of her own. The next morning, Ellie woke before sunrise with the certainty that the wool room had changed the shape of the shed. The boards were still warped. The roof still leaked. The stove still smoked when the wind leaned wrong. But the place no longer felt empty. It felt watched over by all the work that had been hidden inside it. Ellie moved quietly through the dim shed, boiling pump water in a dented pot and spreading the papers on the workbench. She did not leave the ledger in the open. She copied names into her notebook, page by page, because paper could burn and doors could be forced. Her handwriting was slow, cramped, and careful. By noon, she had copied 12 customer names, 6 pattern numbers, and every place Lydia had written the word paid. That was when the truck came. She heard it before she saw it. Tires grinding over the boundary road, engine low and familiar. Ellie folded the ledger closed, wrapped it in the blanket, and slid it beneath the loose board under the workbench. Then she laid 2 broken feed sacks over the spot and stood with the dull shears in one hand, not because she wanted to use them, but because empty hands made her feel too exposed. Cole stepped through the open front door first. He looked cleaner than he had any right to look. White shirt, shaved jaw, hat low over his eyes. Behind him came Waylon, slower, carrying his cane, though Ellie had never seen him need one. "Well," Cole said, glancing around the shed. "You made yourself comfortable." Ellie did not answer. Waylon's eyes went straight to the wool room door. The hinges hung crooked now. The chain still crossed the front, but the door itself no longer sat flush. Waylon saw it. His mouth tightened. "You broke into property that was not yours," he said. Ellie picked up the folded deed from the workbench and held it where both men could see. "The shed is mine." The room was sealed before the parcel sold. It was inside the shed. Cole gave a short laugh. "You always did think finding something meant it belonged to you." "No," Ellie said. "I think buying something means people stop pretending I am trespassing." Waylon stepped past Cole and looked around the room without touching anything. His gaze moved over the stove, the workbench, the pump bucket, The blanket folded near Ellie's bag. It lingered on the wool room, then returned to her face. "This is no place for a woman in your condition. Then you should not have left me with no place." Cole's face darkened, but Wayland lifted one hand. "We are not here to argue," Wayland said. "We are here to be reasonable." That word made Ellie colder than anger would have. Wayland drew an envelope from inside his coat and placed it on the cutting table. $200. More than this rotting shed is worth. You sign it back, you go into town, and you stop embarrassing yourself. Ellie looked at the envelope. $200 could buy a rented room for a while. Food. A doctor visit. Shoes that did not split at the side. It could make the next month easier, but ease had a price, and Wayland never offered anything without taking more. "No." Cole stepped forward. "Ellie, do not be stupid." She turned to him. "Do not call me stupid in a building you were afraid for me to enter." For the first time, Cole looked toward the wool room as if it might speak. Wayland gathered the envelope, his hand steady. "Then you will learn what it costs to be stubborn." They left without shouting. That frightened Ellie more than if they had slammed the door. By evening, the town had already begun to hear their version. Mrs. Harlan came with beans, salt, and a warning tucked beneath ordinary talk. At the mercantile, someone had said Ellie was unstable. Someone else had said pregnancy had made her fanciful. By supper, the story was that she had stolen private family papers from the Voss ranch and was sleeping in a dangerous shed out of spite. Ellie listened with her hands wrapped around a warm cup. "Did you?" Mrs. Harlan asked gently. Ellie looked at her. The postmistress held up one palm. "I am asking, because if you did, they will use it. If you did not, you need to say so plain. I found papers in a room inside the shed I bought." Mrs. Harlan nodded. "Then keep saying it that way." The next day, the banker refused to see Ellie. She had walked into town with 2 clean pages copied from the old customer ledger, hoping to ask about a small loan for roof tin and lamp oil. The young man at the bank window disappeared into the back office. When he returned, he would not meet her eyes. "Mr. Greeley is unavailable. I can wait." "He will remain unavailable." Ellie stood in the quiet bank lobby, feeling every person hear the sentence. Then she folded her pages, put them back in her notebook, and walked out without giving anyone the pleasure of seeing her cry. On the road home, a boy from town rode past on horseback and called, "Wool thief." He was young enough to be forgiven and old enough to know someone had taught him the words. That night, Ellie hid the ledger deeper. She pried up a second board beneath the workbench, wrapped the leather book in oilcloth from an old feed cover, and tucked Lydia's letter separately inside the stovepipe after the fire had gone cold. The photograph stayed in her notebook. The deed she pinned inside her dress when she slept. Near midnight, the pump handle shrieked outside. Ellie woke instantly. For one moment, she lay still in the dark, listening. The stove had burned down to a red eye. Wind moved through the roof holes. Then came another sound. Metal against metal. She rose slowly, took the hammer, and stepped behind the cutting table. A shadow crossed the broken doorway. Not Cole. Too narrow. Maybe one of Wayland's hired men. Maybe a boy paid with whiskey. The figure moved toward the wool room, carrying a lantern shaded by a hand. Ellie did not breathe. The person pulled at the chain, then cursed softly. A boot struck the door. Wood cracked. Ellie lifted the hammer. Then, from outside, a dog barked. The shadow froze. Another bark answered from the road, followed by Mrs. Harlan's voice, sharp and old and fearless. "Whoever is in there, I have a shotgun and bad eyesight." The shadow ran. Ellie reached the doorway in time to see a man disappear into the dark beyond the fence. Mrs. Harlan stood by her truck with a lantern in one hand and, thankfully, no visible shotgun in the other. "I thought you might need checking on," she said. Ellie leaned against the doorframe, shaking so hard the hammer knocked against her thigh. In the morning, they found the pump hose cut clean through. No water came, no matter how hard Ellie worked the handle. Mrs. Harlan looked at the sliced leather, then at the damaged wool room door. "They are not afraid of you being wrong," she said. Ellie touched the place where the deed was pinned beneath her dress. "No," she answered. "They are afraid I can prove I am right." By afternoon, she carried 2 buckets from the neighbor's well, one painful step at a time, and began again. Waylon had taken comfort. The bank had taken help. The town had taken her name and dirtied it. But they had not taken the ledger. They had not taken Lydia's letter. And they had not taken the room. By the end of that week, Ellie understood that a person could be surrounded by open land and still feel hunted. Every morning, she checked the wool room before she checked the stove. Every night, she moved the ledger to a different hiding place. Sometimes, it slept beneath the workbench, sometimes behind a loose board near the pump. Once, during a storm, she wrapped it in oilcloth and held it beneath her blanket all night, feeling the leather cover press against her ribs. The pump hose stayed broken for 2 days. Mrs. Harlan brought what water she could, but she was old and her truck coughed on every hill. Ellie could not keep depending on kindness that might run out. On the third morning, she walked into town with the cut hose coiled inside a feed sack and went to the only place she had not yet tried. Rosie Delgado's dye shed sat behind a small adobe house near the dry creek bed. People in town called Rosie difficult, which usually meant she had told the truth too often for comfort. She was in her late 50s, with silver hair braided down her back, brown hands stained faintly by years of indigo and walnut, and eyes that could measure a lie before a mouth finished forming it. She was stirring something dark in an iron pot when Ellie arrived. "I do not buy wool," Rosie said without looking up. "I am not selling wool. I do not lend money. I am not asking for money." Rosie lifted her eyes then. They moved over Ellie's tired face, swollen belly, worn boots, and the feed sack in her hand. What did they do now? Ellie did not ask who they meant. In that county, some names did not need saying. She opened the sack and showed the cut hose. Rosie looked at the clean slice. "Knife," she said. "Yes, Voss knife, most likely." Ellie waited. Rosie turned back to the pot. "There is spare hose by the back wall. Take what fits." Ellie did not move. "I found something in the old shearing shed." Rosie's hand stopped on the stirring paddle. Ellie reached into her notebook and took out the photograph. Not the ledger. Not yet. Trust had to be built the way color was built. Slowly, in layers, she placed the picture on the table beside the dye pot. Rosie looked at it once, then she sat down. For a long moment, only the pot moved, sending up steam that smelled of bark and iron. "Where did you get this?" Rosie asked. "In the wool room." Rosie closed her eyes. Ellie's voice lowered. "You knew my mother." Rosie did not answer quickly. When she opened her eyes again, the hardness in them had changed into something older. "I knew Lydia May Bell before she married into trouble," she said. "And I knew her after, when trouble started wearing a belt buckle and calling itself business." Ellie gripped the edge of the table. "They told me she was weak." Rosie's mouth tightened. "Men call a woman weak when they are tired of failing to break her." The sentence entered Ellie quietly, then stayed. Rosie picked up the photograph with careful fingers. "Your mother made color like some people make prayer. She could look at a dry hillside and tell you what shade was hiding in it. Mesquite, pecan, indigo, cochineal, yucca root. She knew the old ways, but she had a business mind too. Kept records, took deposits, wrote customers back on time." She had customers? She had more customers than Waylon had patience for. Ellie took out one copied page from the ledger. Rosie read it. Then another. Then the page with the hill country sunset pattern. Her thumb touched the margin where Lydia's initials had been crowded beside the order. "That was hers," Rosie said. "Every bit of it. Why did no one say anything?" Rosie set the page down. "Some did. Not loud enough. Not long enough. And when Lydia died, Waylon told the story first. Around here, the first story often becomes the stone everyone builds on." Ellie looked toward the pot of dark dye. "Can it be undone? Not by wishing." "I am not wishing." Rosie studied her then, really studied her. Ellie stood in a borrowed dress, with dust on the hem, one hand resting on the child inside her, and the other flat on pages her mother had left behind. She did not look powerful. She looked tired, underfed, and scared. But she had not come to sell the papers. She had come with a cut hose and a question. Rosie stood. "Bring the hose." By afternoon, Rosie had repaired the pump line with wire, clamps, and a strip of leather. Ellie held steady while Rosie tightened it. Water came grudgingly, then stronger. Ellie laughed once when it splashed her shoes, and the sound surprised them both. After that, Rosie entered the wool room. She did not speak at first. She touched the loom, the dye jars, the folded labels, and the unfinished blanket with a reverence that made Ellie step back. At the long table, Rosie found a cracked spoon and held it up. "I stirred indigo with this," she said. "Thought it was gone." Ellie swallowed. "Can the work be done again?" Rosie looked at the loom. The work never left. It was only locked away. If you are still here, it means you understand why this mattered. Subscribe for more stories about the people the world underestimated, and let's continue. The first lesson began that evening. Rosie showed Ellie how to clean old wool without ruining the fiber, how to test a strand for strength, how to soak plant matter long enough for color to wake, how to write every step down, not because memory was weak, but because stolen work often began with missing records. "Your mother wrote everything," Rosie said. "That is why they were afraid of her." Ellie wrote that down too. Over the next days, help came in small, cautious forms. Mrs. Harlan brought lamp oil and a sack of cornmeal. The widow from the auction left a basket of pecan hulls by the gate without knocking. A young mother named June Parker came at dusk with 2 bags of old wool and said her grandmother had owned a Lydia blanket once. "I did not know her name," June said. "Just the pattern." Ellie invited her in. That was how the community began, not as a crowd, not as applause, but as one woman stepping over the threshold, then another. Rosie never let Ellie forget whose fight it was. "I can teach your hands," she said one night, as indigo darkened in the pot. "I can tell what I remember. But when Waylon comes for this, and he will, you must decide what name goes on the work." Ellie looked at the folded labels reading Lydia May Bell Woolens. Then she looked at her own notebook, pages full of copied names, recipes, and proof. For the first time, she imagined a label that did not erase anyone. Not Voss. Not hidden. Her hand moved across a blank page. Ellie May Wool Works. From the patterns of Lydia May Bell, the words looked fragile at first. Then Rosie nodded, and Ellie, who had once been told there was nothing in that room for her, understood that a room could hold more than the past. It could hold witnesses. It could hold teachers. It could hold the beginning of a future, if she was brave enough to put her own name on the door. The hearing was held in the county records room on a Thursday morning. It should have been a small matter, at least on paper. A boundary objection. A business name dispute. A question about whether Ellie Mae Voss had the right to use anything found inside the shearing shed she had bought for $18. But Ellie knew better. This was not about a boundary. It was about a locked room, a stolen name, and a woman everyone had expected to stay quiet. She arrived with Rosie Delgado on one side and Mrs. Harlan on the other. June Parker came behind them, carrying her grandmother's old blanket folded inside a flour sack. Ellie carried Lydia's ledger in both hands. She did not hide it this time. Waylon Voss was already seated at the table with Cole beside him and a lawyer from San Antonio arranging papers from a leather case. Cole looked at the floor when Ellie entered. Waylon looked straight at her, as if he still believed staring could make her smaller. Mr. Pritchard, the county clerk, cleared his throat. "We will keep this orderly." Waylon's lawyer stood first. He spoke smoothly, saying the shearing shed had once been connected to Voss Ranch, that the contents inside it were part of Voss family history, and that Ellie, while understandably emotional, had no right to profit from materials tied to the Voss name. The word emotional sat in the room like a trap. Ellie stayed still. Then, the lawyer placed an envelope on the table. "My client is willing to settle this today. $500 in exchange for the return of all papers, recipes, designs, and customer lists found inside the shed. $500. For a woman with a leaking roof, a child coming, and no bank willing to help her. It was not a small number." Waylon leaned back in his chair. He thought he had found the price of her fear. Mr. Pritchard turned to Ellie. "Mrs. Voss, do you wish to respond?" Ellie stood. Her legs felt weak, but her hands were steady. She placed the ledger on the table. Then, the photograph of Lydia beside the loom. Then, the copied pages of orders. Then, Lydia's letter. Finally, June unfolded her grandmother's blanket, so the border showed clearly. 3 triangles, 1 curved line. This was never only Voss work, Ellie said. The lawyer smiled thinly. No one is questioning your feelings about your mother. You are questioning her labor. The room went quiet. Ellie opened the ledger to the first page. Lydia May Bell, she read. Wool dye and blanket orders. First full season. She turned the page toward Mr. Pritchard. These early orders are in my mother's name. The customers are listed. The colors are listed. The deposits are listed. Then, her name begins to disappear. She turned several pages. Here, Bell is crossed out. Here, Voss is written above it. Here, the same pattern is sold under Voss Woolworks. The lawyer leaned forward. A family business often absorbs the work of its members. Rosie stood. I was there, she said. Wayland's face changed. Rosie placed one hand on the table. Lydia made those colors. Lydia drew those patterns. Lydia kept those customers. Wayland Voss did not know indigo from axle grease unless someone showed him the bill. A few people near the doorway shifted. Ellie had not realized the room had filled. Clerks, neighbors, the widow from the auction, even a ranch hand she remembered from the old days. The lawyer asked, Do you have proof? Rosie pointed to the ledger. A woman's handwriting is proof when men have not burned it yet. Ellie unfolded Lydia's letter and read only the lines that mattered. They will say I only helped. They will say the ranch made the name, and I was lucky to stand near it. Do not believe them. Cole lowered his eyes. Wayland did not. Mr. Pritchard looked at the deed, then at the ledger. The property was legally purchased and recorded in Mrs. Voss's name. Unless the contents were separately reserved before sale, they transferred with the structure. Wayland's voice hardened. Those materials are Voss history. Ellie looked at him. No, they are Lydia May Bell's history. His jaw tightened. She married into my family. She worked with her hands. She used my wool. And you used her name until you could cover it with yours. For a moment, the old fear rose in Ellie. She remembered the kitchen, the porch, the closed ranch door. Then she looked down at the new label in her notebook. Ellie May Woolworks. From the patterns of Lydia May Bell, I am not selling under the Voss name, she said. I am not asking permission to use yours. I am putting my work out under my name, with my mother's name where people can finally see it. Wayland stared at her. I will give you $1,000, he said. The room shifted. 1,000, he repeated. For the shed, the loom, the papers, all of it. You walk away today. Ellie thought of the pump water in her palm, the first fire in the stove, the photograph falling from the wall, Rosie touching the old dye spoon, the baby moving beneath Lydia's letter. $1,000 could buy time, but it could not buy back a name once she sold it. No, Ellie said. Cole took a step toward her. Ellie, be reasonable. She looked at him. No, this goes out under my name. June Parker stepped forward and placed her grandmother's blanket beside Ellie's samples. My grandmother bought this from Lydia Bell, she said. Not from him. Then another woman spoke. Then an old ranch hand. Then Mrs. Harlan, with her gloved hands folded tight. One voice did not break the wall, but several began to crack it. Mr. Pritchard gathered the papers. The deed stands, he said. The boundary objection is denied pending further evidence. Mrs. Voss may not trade as Voss Wool Works, but there is no county restriction preventing her from operating under her own name. It was not a grand courtroom victory. No gavel struck, but Ellie knew the sound of a lock opening. Wayland left without looking at her. Cole followed. Outside, under the hard Texas sun, Rosie stood beside Ellie on the courthouse steps. You held, Rosie said. Ellie pressed the ledger to her chest. No, she answered softly. We did. The first blanket Ellie sold under her own name did not sell quickly. That was what made it real. There was no crowd, no miracle, no sudden line down the street. There was only a Saturday market, a borrowed table, and 6 folded blankets beneath a canvas awning. Each one carried a small label sewn by hand. Ellie May Woolworks. From the patterns of Lydia May Bell. For the first hour, people only looked. Some whispered. Some touched a corner of wool, then stepped away as if Wayland Voss might charge them for curiosity. Ellie did not chase them. Near noon, June Parker arrived with her mother, a silver-haired woman who unfolded one indigo and clay-red blanket with trembling hands. "My mother had this pattern," she whispered. Ellie opened a copied page from Lydia's ledger. "There is an order here from Alma Parker. Baby blanket, indigo border, paid in full." The old woman sat down slowly. "That was me." After that, people came closer. A ranch wife recognized a wedding pattern. A retired schoolteacher remembered her sister saving for a Lydia blanket. A young mother asked if Ellie could make one small enough for a cradle. By afternoon, 4 blankets were sold and 2 were ordered. Ellie wrote every name down. Deposit paid. Color requested. Delivery promised. Each line felt like a board being put back into a house that had been torn apart. Cole came near sunset. He stood by the hitching rail with his hat in his hands. "You did well," he said. "Yes," Ellie answered. "Maybe we could talk. Maybe I could come by the shed." "No." The word was quiet, but it did not bend. Cole looked wounded. "I made mistakes. You made choices. My father pushed. You let him." He looked away. "I am the baby's father." "Then be better than you have been," Ellie said. "But you are not coming back through my door because the room has value now." She had meant the wool room. She had also meant herself. That evening, Ellie returned to the shed with market money folded inside her notebook. Rosie had stacked clean wool by the loom. Mrs. Harlan had left cornmeal by the stove. Someone had patched another strip of roof tin while she was gone. The money was not a fortune. It would not fix everything, but it was earned money. Her money. Money tied to work no one had managed to steal. Ellie opened Lydia's ledger and wrote beneath the last old entry, "First market day under my own name. 4 sold, 2 ordered, work continues." The victory was not loud. It was a patched roof, an open door, a visible name, and a woman no longer waiting for permission. By the time Ellie's son was born, the shearing shed no longer looked like a place waiting to fall. It still carried its scars. One wall leaned. The floorboards complained. Rain still found the south corner when the wind came hard. But the roof held better than before. The pump worked with a new hose, and the wool room door no longer wore a chain. It stood open most days. Inside, the loom had become the heart of the building. Rosie oiled the old pecan wood until it warmed beneath her hands. June Parker sewed flour sack curtains for the window. Mrs. Harlan brought a shelf from the post office storeroom, and on it, Ellie kept Lydia's ledger, her own notebook, jars of dye, and a tin box for paid orders. The work was not easy. A new baby broke time into small pieces. Ellie learned to weave between feedings, write orders while he slept, and stir dye with one foot rocking his cradle. Some days the wool tangled. Some days the baby cried through supper. Some days Ellie felt grateful and exhausted in the same breath. Rosie never let her mistake rest for weakness. "Even a loom rests between blankets," she said. So Ellie learned that too. By autumn, people had begun calling the shed by a new name. Ellie Mae's place. "I am going to Ellie Mae's place for wool. Leave the pecan hulls at Ellie Mae's place." Rosie is teaching dye at Ellie Mae's place on Tuesday. Each time Ellie heard it, something inside her settled. A place could change names. Maybe a woman could too. On the new sign outside the shed, June's brother painted the words carefully. "Ellie Mae Bell Wool Works." From the patterns of Lydia Mae Bell. When the sign went up, Ellie stood beneath it with her son asleep against her shoulder. Rosie had paint on her fingers. Mrs. Harlan wiped her eyes and blamed the dust. No one cheered. They only stood there in the late sun and looked. That was enough. Letters began arriving after that. One came from San Antonio. Another from Kerrville. One came all the way from Santa Fe, written by the granddaughter of a woman whose name Ellie recognized in Lydia's ledger. "My grandmother always said this blanket was made by a woman who knew how to put sunset into wool. We never knew her name. Now we do." Ellie read that sentence 3 times. Then she placed the letter inside Lydia's ledger, not as evidence. As restoration, one evening, after the day's work was done, Ellie carried her son into the wool room. The half-finished blanket Lydia had left on the loom was finally complete. Ellie had not rushed it. "She had studied the pattern?" asked Rosie. undone mistakes, and tried again until her hands understood what her memory could not. The blanket lay across the table now, indigo deep as dusk, clay red warm as the road home, yucca yellow soft as morning light. At the border, Ellie had woven Lydia's mark, 3 triangles, 1 curved line. Beside it, almost hidden, she had added 1 new stitch, a single bell. Rosie saw it and smiled. "Good," she said. "You left room for yourself." Ellie carried the blanket outside. The hill country stretched gold beneath the sinking sun. Blankets moved on the line, lifting and falling like quiet flags. Women laughed softly near the dye pots. Mrs. Harlan's truck waited by the gate. The repaired roof shone dull silver above them all. For years, Ellie had believed she was the leftover part of a story no one wanted to tell. A girl with a dead mother's blanket, a wife without power, a pregnant woman sent out through a closed door. But the shed had taught her differently. Ruined things were not always empty. Quiet women were not always weak. And a locked room could become a doorway when the right hands refused to let it stay shut. That night, Ellie opened her notebook and wrote 1 final line beneath the season's orders. "The work continues, and this time, the name stays." Then she placed the notebook beside Lydia's ledger, blew out the lamp, and looked once more at the open wool room door. The room, they said, had nothing for her, had given her a trade, a truth, a community, and a future. It had given her back her mother. It had given her back herself. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to remember that a broken beginning does not mean a broken life.